We'll look a little more in this first area of the debate at this question then of what objective knowledge is. And I think everybody in a way agrees that no one's making a very, very strident case for this monolithic adamantine knowledge that we would all reach as a final goal. So, Suchitra, I wanted to turn to you in terms of responding to Rupert's remarks about the kind of reductive process as well. Because you're dealing both, as you were saying, with sort of denying your expectations of a subject and also with looking at billions and billions of electrons and looking at this very small area. So there's that question as well. For you, is that to you a kind of reality that you're seeing, those very, very small electrons that you're looking at?
Yeah, actually, that's a really interesting question because I think that there's different ways of approaching science. One is reductionist and the other is emergent. I study emergent forms of physical phenomena. So in the reductionist way, indeed, one would think there's a theory of everything. At some point, you're going to gather enough information that you can write this theory, and then you will be able to predict everything in the universe. That's a very different way of... So there, indeed, it's about reducing everything to its fundamentals. And once you know what the fundamental is, you can build everything back up. What I do is emergent forms of physics, which is very different. And so there, what we say is, the way we approach doing experiments, discovering new phenomena, is that trillions of electrons, as many as the stars in the observable universe, in a milligram of material, when all of these interact together, much the same way as, all of us interact together, or neurons in the brain interact together, it's absurd to think that a collective phenomena can be reduced into the constituent particles and that those will explain what is happening collectively. Instead, what emergence is that when these trillions of electrons come together, what we observe macroscopically is completely different from how each of the single particles behave. So yes, absolutely. I think reductionist ways of knowing, of doing science, I would strongly push back against because I don't think that's how knowing occurs. But I don't think that science is reductionist. I think emergence is absolutely at the heart of what I do as an experimental physicist. I look at a quantum system with trillion electrons, and when I measure it, what they collectively do is nothing like what an individual electron does, and that is the portal to accessing new quantum forms of matter experimentally. So it doesn't have to be that one goes to the realm of beyond experiment and necessarily mysticism to access emergent forms of behavior. Those are accessed physically, experimentally.
Thank you. And just a really quick follow-up. I just wanted to, as you were talking about the idea of an encounter and this revelation within quantum physics that the observer affects what's being observed. So, and is that something then that you deal with tangibly when you're researching? Is this something that's affecting your experimental process?
Yeah, that's a really good question about encounter. I think it's very much so. There's again two ways of approaching what happens when you do an experiment. One is starting with a model and the experiment being to test the model. So we all know when we think we know something's going to happen, you'll find what it is you think is going to happen. So the idea that Rupert was talking about, a prejudice and self-confirmation bias, is often true just because when you start with a model, you expect that is what is going to be experimentally realized. Very often that's what you will find because you throw away all the rest of the information that is actually being given to you by the experiment. On the other hand, what the encounter is about is if you go in saying, it is unknown. Yes, I have prejudices wherein I think this might happen, but actually I need to be attuned to what is happening in the experiment, knowing full well that what I thought is going to happen is likely not going to, and it always deviates in a way I didn't think it would. So even if I go in thinking, yeah, it's not going to do what I think it's going to do, I still think it's going to deviate in a certain way, and what it actually does is completely different. So that's what I mean by the encounter, is if you go in knowing that it is an unknown beyond your imagination, then that's when you actually encounter what it is that's happening.
Yes, great. Thank you. Tommy, I wanted to come in because you were talking about the rational tradition, and I wonder if that's a way to talk about knowledge, that in a way the totalizing claims being made by rationalism, or the rational method, were what you were questioning. Well, you weren't saying let's dispense with it altogether.
No.
But there's need for gaps in that. Is that part of your
I mean,
argument?
we have to understand that human knowledge, both what we take to be an accumulation of facts or everything we know, is incomplete. And whatever our best tools, our best way of inquiring into the world is, will always be limited. So in doing so, it gets rid of this kind of strong claim of objectivity, right? Because objectivity presumes that there is a form of knowledge or reality that's unchanging, that is fixed, static, and that regardless of your social position, your location, et cetera, that you would have knowledge of this. Now, the rationalists are going to argue this is through rational philosophical processes. Medievalists and others like Plato would say this is through intuition, trying to grasp the forms, this kind of formal reality that, by the way, exists in kind of this ether well above anything we perceive, right? And you have people today that make very similar arguments, even in trying to question the objective epistemological tradition. Things like standpoint epistemology seem to interact with the world, saying that your social location gives you an almost immediate knowledge of your experience and the truth behind that. And I would want a much more mediated process, because if we understand that knowledge itself is limited, that we're trying to grasp something that is very much contextual, something that's changing, something that if you did the same thing in a different location would have a completely different outcome, effect, or even catalyst, that requires us to have a certain kind of humility. And I dare not say the word relativism, because I think that's it's a bad way of understanding this kind of gap that we have in human epistemology. But it is something that tries to get us to understand that just because we want to understand one outcome of knowledge or one notion of truth doesn't mean that we can grasp it. And even if we can identify certain patterns of reality, knowing that every time you do X, it tends to lead to Y, that doesn't mean that it's always going to lead to Y. And part of the arrogance of the Western tradition is that in assuming that we've had reason and we've produced Y 100 or 1,000 times and that it will always be Y, is that it misses the gap of that one time, that one existential qualifier where it won't be Y. And rather than admitting that's an error and takes us to a whole new field of understanding different ways of knowing or understanding why X doesn't cause Y, we see that as an error, a mistake, or dare I say, people who arrived at that because they're not rational, right? That's the problem. That's the problem with both presupposing that we know what knowledge is, that we have an accumulation of various X's, and that the process by which we get to X is absolutely correct. Rather, we have to take a step back and say, well, maybe there are tentative and, dare I say, culturological ways of formulating knowledge, different schemas by which different social groups, locations, et cetera, arrive at Y or not yet Y that are still valid. And in the Western tradition, I find that it's very rare that we're willing to engage that either intuitively or as a prospect in the history of philosophy or even experimentally.
Thank you. And we're going to have, in the next section, we'll talk more about that power dynamic as well. And Rupert, before we turn to that, I want to turn to you because you've written in The Science Delusion precisely about what Tommy's describing, really a kind of refusal to accept novel theories within Western science and certain prevailing assumptions with which you disagree. So could you talk more about that, this question of what happens when the scientific method excludes entire theories?
Yes, well, there is this serious problem in science that the idea of scientific paradigms, a very well-known idea, first put forward by Thomas Kuhn, historian of science, is the idea there's a model of reality at any given time, and then in a scientific revolution, it's overthrown and it's replaced by another model of reality. The classic example is the medieval idea that the planets go around the Earth and all the stars, everything goes around the Earth, replaced by the idea that the Earth and the other planets are going around the Sun, the heliocentric model, which was a revolution in thought. And Darwin's evolutionary theory was a revolution in thought. Now, the only trouble is that Kuhn's idea of scientific revolutions, so you might think, well, these revolutions, each one's a sort of opening up. But actually, what's actually happened in science is that one sort of dictatorship or totalitarian system been replaced by another. And the idea has been that there's a global kind of science that applies everywhere in the world. The dominant paradigm for the last 150 years has been mechanistic materialism, which is what I discuss in my book, The Science Delusion. Basically, the idea that matter is the only reality, consciousness is derived from matter, the mind is nothing but the activity of the brain, God's nothing but an idea in human minds and therefore inside human heads. Mechanistic materialism has come to dominate all science over the entire world. If you study science in Africa, in South America, in China, in India, it's the same science that's taught in textbooks here. The idea, there's no one thought system has ever conquered the whole world in the way that science has done. Christian missionaries tried to convert everyone to Christianity and failed, but scientific missionaries have converted virtually every country in the world to mechanistic materialism, at least when they're talking about science. And so one of the problems has been that this view has become so dominant, so dogmatic, that it excludes inquiry within science, holds back inquiry in many areas of science, as I show in my book. I can't go into the details now because there isn't time. But it's become a very restrictive framework. And I think one way forward, taking up one of Tommy's points, is to have a more pluralistic approach. And I think this should apply in science too. If there were more funding agencies pursuing quite different agendas, even different national science policies, I think we'd get a richer and more interesting science. For example, if in India there was a really big emphasis on studying things that Indians know a lot more about than we do in Western countries, like the nature of conscious states, the way that physiological states can be changed through breathing practices, as many yogis do. And there are some studies of this, but it's very niche and in the background. There's a great deal we could learn about human physiology and consciousness through serious research in science. But I worked in India as a scientist, and I found that most of my colleagues there were not at all interested in local phenomena like that. They all wanted to get papers published in Nature and Science and do science the way it was done in the West, because that's what gives prestige. So I think that there's a much greater pluralism would be much better for science. And in fact, what we should realize, it's not science, it's the sciences. There are lots of different sciences, each with their own procedures, but at the moment they are unified by this mechanistic materialist paradigm, which we need to grow out of.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below, or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.